Hello, welcome to Russian History of Russia. My name is Asya, and today we're wrapping up the first big chapter of the series, the 3 centuries long history of the medieval Slavic state called Kievan Rus. In this episode, we're going to see how different parts of the disintegrated Rus state are going to start falling into place, forming a much more familiar map of Eastern Europe, and look a bit closer at those of its principalities that are eventually going to come together to form a new state that you know as Russia.
It's big, it's cold, it's full of gas and gold. It's 1200 years old, but still never does as told. We're Christians, but not really Europeans, but from Asia. We send the ducks to space and kill the Tsars on occasion. We drink sodas made from bread, eat our enemies in kasha, and that's why it's so fun to study history of Russia.
So in 12th century, Kievan throne, changing its occupants every few years, lost its former influence over Rus. Although still desirable and sought after prize, kind of like an entitled-only president of the 200-people board of directors. Several major fragments of the first East Slavic state grew independent, beginning with the southwestern territories of Galicia and Volhynia. They broke away even before Grand Prince Mstislav's death in 1132. This branch of oldest of Monomach children grew into a kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, also known as Ruthenia, that was more influenced by trade and war with the western neighbors of Hungary, Poland, and Lithuania than any of its former siblings to the northeast. Even culturally, it gradually grew closer to its Catholic neighbors, while northern Russia, starting 12th century, had way less positive experience, basically being crusaded by the Catholic Knight Orders, which we'll get to a bit later. These territories will reach their prime under Mstislav's grandson, Danil, in mid-13th century, and exist independently until mid-14th, when power struggles eventually led to the extinction of this branch of Rurikhovich rulers, and the lands were incorporated into Poland and Lithuania. They'll go through a lot of more historical turmoil between then and now, but their borders can still easily be recognized on today's maps in western Ukraine and southern Poland. The rest of the provinces, Chernigov, Polotsk, Smolensk, Ryazan, Pereyaslavl, Novgorod, and Vladimir-Suzdal, all went their separate ways after Mstislav's death. The Chernigov rulers, for example, gained a habit of joining forces with random princes and even the very Polovtsi to attack other lands, and of course Kiev, taking and losing the first chair several times, not that it actually mattered that much at that point. Chernigov was a powerful duchy, but unstable politics and especially devastating for it results of the first Mongolian invasion led to further disintegration and decline. More northern principalities benefited from a significant south-to-north migration throughout 12th and 13th centuries, fueled by the non-stop internecine turf wars for the Kievan lands, as well as the resumed nomadic invasions, and finished off with the Mongol-flavored icing on the cake. Polotsk, strategically located between Kiev, Novgorod, Eastern Rus lands, and Scandinavia, was one of the first to benefit from the power struggles, growing strongly independent and enriched by trade. It even briefly expanded into the lands of modern-day Latvia and Lithuania before those were conquered by the Teutonic Order in the 13th century. As for the Polotsk homelands, they escaped the fate of being flattened by the Mongols, only to be snatched by Lithuania in 1307. Smolensk did pretty well too for a while. Mstislav's son and his dynasty retained the power in the midst of the brotherly wars all around, as well as friendly ties with Polotsk and Galicia-Volhynia, the latter even supporting Smolensk princes for the Kievan rule a couple of times. First arrival of the Mongols, however, left the principality weakened and defenseless, causing it to depend more and more on its luckier eastern neighbor Vladimir-Suzdal. Novgorod was an odd duck. It developed an unusually democratic medieval form of governing, becoming a Novgorod republic. The aristocracy, known in Rus as boyars, formed sort of a parliamentary branch called Novgorod Veche, or Novgorod Council. Veche here had a power to invite and disinvite princes, largely for defense purposes, and usually it was the rulers from the Vladimir-Suzdal governing branch. Veche would also elect other important officials and hold them accountable, as well as set the taxes and even start and end wars. Originating from the tradition of tribal councils, these structures existed in most of Kievan Rus cities from the very beginning, with the Novgorod one dating all the way back to foundation of Rus in 862. But only the Novgorod Veche by the 12th century became so influential compared to other principalities that it held power over princes, not the other way around. Novgorod Republic only lost its governing independence in 1478 to the new local power, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which means it existed for whooping 600 years. At its peak, Novgorod Republic territory was huge, stretching all the way from Baltic Sea to Ural Mountains. It existed on the remnants of the Varangian and Volga trade routes with Byzantine and Scandinavia, and Baltic Sea trade with Western Europe in the later centuries, with fur and wax exports creating the biggest cash flow, which they really needed because they couldn't grow enough grain themselves. Agricultural production in northern lands of Novgorod and Vladimir-Suzdal was based on rye, buckwheat, barley, hops, flax, and heavy fishing and hunting, which included honey hunting, one of the crucial forms of food sourcing in Kievan Rus, and especially for Novgorodians with their northern climate so not ideal for farming. There was no tradition of beekeeping up until 16th century, so honey, which was their only known source of sugar at the time, was gathered from the wild tree hives. Besides being an important food source, honey was used for alcoholic mead production. From the earliest of times, Vikings and Slavs fermented raw honey for 20+ years in wooden barrels buried in the ground, sometimes with hops and berries added, and later switching to brewing it, which only took 1 month, so it's understandable because waiting for a drink for over 20 years anywhere outside of Manhattan bar is just not acceptable. These old recipes produced highly potent drink used in rituals and celebrations, and today its lighter version, medavucha, is still a calling card for cities of Novgorod and Suzdal. By the way, I've been thinking about doing a bonus episode on Kievan Rus and early Russia traditions and cultures and customs, folklore, food, drinks, stuff like that. So let me know in the comments if that's something you'd find interesting. European crusades into Byzantine lands in the 12th century proved to be so fun that Christian knight orders started popping up everywhere, like mushrooms after rain, an analogy brought to you by Russian idioms. They mostly targeted pagan neighbors, but since the Great Schism in 1054 between Eastern and Western churches led to an open season on Orthodox Christians, Novgorod had a handful of visits as well, most notable of which were battles where future pop hero of Russia Alexander Nevsky, as an invited Novgorod prince, won against the Swedish, Finnish, and Norwegian armies, and in 1242 known as the Battle on the Ice, where he again achieved a highly praised in Russia victory against the Livonian order. The battle took place on a frozen lake, hence the name. And there are a lot of folklore spins on it and historical myths. They usually include the ice epically breaking under the knight's heavy armor, either as an act of God or as a result of Alexander's military genius. In reality, it's unlikely there was any ice breaking at all, just good old-fashioned military strategy. But Alexander certainly was a very talented military general who in his lifetime had to deal with not only the northern crusaders but with Mongols as well. The vast northeastern territories were first known as the Rostov Principality and with the 12th century as Duchy of Vladimir-Suzdal after the two major centers. These lands were experiencing significant population growth and redistribution caused by migration from the south and encouraged by its rulers. Rostov Vladimir-Suzdal lands in 1113 to 1157 were ruled by Vladimir Monomach's youngest son, Yuri I Dolgoruki, which translates to Yuri or George the Long-Armed. The nickname is most likely attributed to his expansionist endeavors that included taking advantage of Ryazan and Pereyaslavl principalities, as well as fighting for the Kievan throne, which he did occupy for the last 2 years of his life. In 1147, Yuri met with another prince in that small settlement named Moskva after the river it sat on. That meeting was the first recorded mentioning of Moscow, Russia's capital. 10 years later, Yuri fortified that small settlement, turning it into a small city, which is why he is known as the founder of Moscow, even though that city was burned to ashes by the Mongols together with its inhabitants. Moscow is not going to be of any significance whatsoever until the end of the 13th century, when it was inherited by a prince who managed to elevate that unlikely candidate into the big boys' ranks. Yuri's son, Andrei, continued to grow Vladimir-Suzdal's power to the point where in 1169 he took Kiev, but instead of becoming its prince, he just robbed and burned it. Not something ever done before, because normally princes would fight for Kievan throne, not for its destruction. Andrei, however, preferred to return to Vladimir, which he began to see as a more important center for him to hold than Kiev. The city of Vladimir saw a lot of its cherished white stone monuments erected under Andrei's rule, some still standing today, like the Golden Gate or the elegant Church of Intersection on the Nerl. Andrei's successor in Vladimir in 1177 to 1212 was Vsevolod, nicknamed the Big big nest. Vsevolod spent his youth in Byzantine court, and on his way back he supposedly stopped at Tbilisi, where he married an Ossetian princess. As you might have guessed, his nickname comes from his achievements in producing children, up to 14 and all with one wife. Although I would argue that it's her who deserves the medal for the job. Vsevolod was a highly successful ruler under whom Vladimir-Suzdal reached its prime. He encouraged smaller city growth across his lands, which provided him with better and bigger army. He even defeated the main external enemy of Vladimir-Suzdal, Volga-Bulgaria to the east. The successor of the state, by the way, is still Muslim and exists today in a form of Republic of Tatarstan in the modern-day Russia. Vsevolod's children were enthroned in other lands like Ryazan and Novgorod, and his influence could be felt all across Rus. With his death, however, and so many self-produced contenders for the throne, 13th century Vladimir-Suzdal fragmented even further into about 7 smaller principalities. This process of further disintegration plagued all of Rus' lands. By the arrival of the Mongols in 1240s, only Novgorod Republic managed to keep it together. It's important to note, however, that despite this giant corporation of Rurik's descendants creating decentralization forces, Rus society did not look the way the political maps did. Shared culture, language, faith, and customs, combined with urgency to defend against surrounding enemies, were a powerful unifying factor that, given a little more time, could very likely lead to a new unified state. But Rus did not have time. Far in the east, in the lands of modern-day Mongolia, one nomadic people proved to be not like all other. In 1206, it began its expansion across Asia, and nothing could stop them. In less than just 2 decades, the first Mongolian army had reached the southern Rus lands. They were prepared for battle, but were merely sent to scout the area and were far from the full scale of Mongolian force. In 1223, these scouts were met in the Battle of Kalka River near modern-day Donetsk by almost all of Rus' forces except for the Vladimir-Suzdal one, because that one was conveniently late to the battle. They were even joined by the Polovtsi, who were actually attacked first a year earlier, and they even warned the Galicia prince, but were ignored for over a year because they weren't exactly BFFs with the Rus, having invaded it for over a century and all that. That battle was a disaster. Mongols obliterated the united army with minimal losses on their part, significantly weakening Rus for what was coming next. Only 2 princes, Chernigov and Volhynian, survived the battle. Despite Rus laying before them naked and defenseless, Mongols retreated and vanished in the east. Rus princes, shaking it off like a bad dream, continued squabbling with one another until 13 years later the Mongols returned. This time with much more on their mind than scouting. And that is all for today. In the next episode, Rus under the Mongols and the Grand Duchy of Moscow. I'll see you then, but in the meantime, please share what you thought of this first part of the series. Advice and criticism are welcome, but words of support mean the world to me too. And let me know what kind of bonus topics, like the one I mentioned before, you might be interested in. And naturally, likes and support are huge motivation for me to keep going, so thank you so much for your interest and support. Спасибо и до встречи!